Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. How are you guys doing? How has the session been going so far? Hopefully, you're feeling energized and learning a lot. So really excited to be here. My name is Asong Suh. I'm a managing director here at SAN. I lead all of our work in the public sector. As you guys heard from Fred's keynote, we really spend a lot of time, helping leaders in local government, in cities, in counties, and states. Really help them serve their citizens better, right? So for our session today, we want to talk about Urban World Fund. And really the focus here is, to talk about how can you really help public sector leaders to be able to generate some of the funds that they need in order to fund a lot of the things that we've been spending a lot of our days today talking about, right? So I'm going to start here with this quote from Ben McAdams. So Ben McAdams was the mayor of Salt Lake County, Utah. And I think this really encapsulates a lot of what my talk is going to be about. So what Ben and his team did in Salt Lake County was that they really took inventory of all of the assets that they have. And when I say assets here for a city, we're talking about things like land that the city owns. We're talking about vacant buildings, parking lots, all of these assets that they own. So what they did was they took inventory of that. And what they found was that, shockingly, was worth about $10 billion, a number that was significantly higher than what they actually have in their books. And what they figured out was that if you could generate even a slightest yield from these assets, you can generate a lot of funds that they can then use to be able to run the infrastructure of the city without necessarily raising taxes, right? So that's the important part, without raising taxes on citizens, right? So as we go through our discussions today, so keep that in mind, that ultimately what you want to do is to be able to say, how do I put my assets to work in the city and then use those funds to improve the water network, the road network, and all whatnot without, kind of raising taxes. The interesting thing is that Salt Lake County is not unique. Right? Most cities in the US are virtually sitting on a virtual gold mine without knowing it, right? And so on the flip side, cities are dealing with a lot, right? You have a lot of aging infrastructure. You have an aging workforce. There's economic challenges. Just this week, I think we heard in Washington, D.C., where there was raw sewage flowing into the Potomac River, causing those environmental challenges that's causing. But then on the flip side, cities also have a lot of data, as we've been hearing throughout the day, fragmented data in a lot of other systems. And the thing that actually compounds this even more to make it more difficult is that cities are struggling with funding cuts, right? So if you look, there's a lot of news articles about, the federal government reducing the fundings that cities are getting. Right? And so on the one hand, you have this virtual gold mine that you're sitting on, but then on the other hand, you're dealing, with a lot of challenges that need funding in order to be able to solve those challenges. And so ultimately, the question, if you're a local government, is there a way that I can match these two? Can I leverage kind of this virtual gold mine to be able to generate the income and the resources that I need in order to solve some of the problems that I just mentioned earlier? So the answer is yes. However, right, there's always a but with these things, right? So let's first of all just spend some time to talk about, what's the current state. So there's a paradox, right? So, cities typically focus on the income statement, right? So they spend a lot of time, if you look at this iceberg, really thinking about the top part of that, right? It's the taxes and the expenses that the city has to deal with. That's what they need in order to kind of run the city. However, they spend less time thinking about what's really below, which is the assets that the city owns, all of the land and all of these other things that I mentioned earlier, right? So that's one first thing to keep in mind. And then the second thing is that there's a visibility gap, right? So a lot of cities tend to keep their assets on book value, right? So meaning if an asset or a piece of land in the city's books 50 years ago was a certain value, they've essentially kept that same value and haven't been able to bring it to fair market value, right? So that's the second current state. But then as you notice from the conversation that the Salt Lake County did, the reality is that that asset is actually worth more. So when you actually look at the value of it, there's a lot more that you can get from it, right? And so there's an opportunity here where you have cities that are really worthy, but but you're cash poor, right? In that you have all of these assets in your books, but you're not really generating the income and the resources that you need from it to fund the city. And so this is where the idea of an urban wealth fund comes in, right? Which is like, okay, how do you then kind of bridge that gap in terms of being able to use those resources, to fund the city? And so the question is, what is an urban wealth fund, right? So put simply, if you think of us as citizens or corporations or whatever, you have assets, right? So we're here in Florida. If you have a second vacation home or something in Florida, rather than have that asset sit there yearly where you're not doing something with it, you typically use it to generate some sort of income, right? So same thing for businesses. If you have machines, you use those assets to be able to generate income. So for an urban wealth fund, it's really a similar concept. It's how do you use those assets, the land, the vacant buildings, to be able to generate the resources that the fund is that you need to do investments. In order to do that, for the urban wealth fund, there are three things that it typically has. One is things need to be transparent, right? In other words, they tend to be able to have value, know which assets you have, and then be able to actually value those assets, at market value, right? The second thing is that there's political independence, right? So these are put in a separate corporation, something that's private, that's at arm's length from the politicians. Because, you're a politician, the short-term things that you need to deal with, it's very quick to make decisions that in the long run are not necessarily best, so you can put these, they tend to be in private corporations. And then the third piece here is that there's a clear objective in terms of maximizing value, right? And when I say maximize value, this is not thinking, like Wall Street where you want to make profit at all costs, right? It's maximizing value for the communities where this thing operates, however that value is defined, right? And so those are like the three pieces that you typically would find, when we talk about an urban wealth fund. So the concept itself is not new, right? So urban wealth funds have been around. So I'm going to talk about three quick examples where this has been implemented. Unfortunately, none of them are here in the United States, which we'll talk a little bit later why that hasn't happened here and, how we should think about that, right? The first here is in Hamburg in Germany, right? They set up an urban wealth fund where they were able to redevelop part of the city's harbor. And then the investments that came from that, they were then able to use that, to build a lot of housing units and then a lot of workspaces, right? And again, the key thing here is all of this was done without raising taxes, right? They were able to use the investment, from that. The second example here is from Singapore, right? I think if you follow a lot of, international things, you almost certainly know about Singapore. I know for the past 50, 60 years or so, Singapore, through their sovereign wealth fund, has really been able to move from a developing country to one of the most developed countries in the world, right? And part of the way they've been able to do this, there are other things on there, but part of the way they've been able to do this to be able to use the assets that the country has and then use those investments, to kind of drive development, right? The third example is Copenhagen in Denmark, right? So for this one, maybe I spend a little bit more time to add more color here. So if you go back, in the late 90s, Copenhagen was a struggling kind of manufacturing city, low tax basis, high unemployment. And so what the city did was they essentially took inventory of the land that they had. At that point, they could have done one or two things. They could, kind of keep the land the way they own it or sell it, essentially privatize it. What they did was they kept the land, but they set up a private or public corporation to manage that as a private entity. And so then the next thing they did was be able to borrow against that land. And then they used the resources or the investment, the money that came from the land to build a railway, like urban transport. And the stops along those urban transport paths, the land around that area, the value went up because now there's like a subway running next to it, right? And so they could then use the higher returns that came from that land to pay for that railway, and then also use some of the investments that came from that to really be able to, fund things like 100,000 homes and whatnot, right? So it's a very good example for where this has worked quite well, right? And so if I'm trying to, okay, you say, great, I'm hearing all of these, this is nice, I want to go out and set up an urban wide fund in my city. How do I actually go about doing that, right? And so there are 4 steps, right? First thing is you got to take inventory of what you have. You need to be able to identify, what are the assets. And again, not every asset has commercial value, right? I might have a piece of land that's a public park, right? I'm not going to go, make money off of that. But if I have the city owns a piece of parking lot in prime location, well, that's something that you can use if you redevelop it into like a mixed housing infrastructure with a parking garage at the bottom. All of a sudden, that piece of land becomes something that has more value with it, right? So the first thing is you got to take inventory of the assets that you own, right? And the second thing, you got to, have value for those assets. If you don't know the value of something, you can't really, extract things from it, right? And getting value means going beyond, valuing the assets and only looking at them at book value. You got to look at what's the actual fair market value for those assets, today, right? And then the third thing, which is we talked about earlier, is there has to be independence in terms of managing these assets. It can't be the politicians or the city running. So you got to set up, some sort of public-owned corporation. The ownership still stays with the city, but in terms of like the managing and the day-to-day running of that asset, you run it as a private entity where you really focus on creating and maximizing value from it, right? And so that's the third thing. And then the last piece here is, again, it's about putting kind of that governance in place in terms of, board of directors, the value in terms of saying, okay, we want to maximize shareholder return or stakeholder return, whatever you want to call it, from those assets that you have, right? So, I'm sure that there's more details as you go through each of these, but largely speaking, those are the 4 steps that you need to go through, to be able to set this up. So then, if this is such a great idea, right, how come we're not hearing a lot of this in the US and it's not running and everybody clamoring to do this, right? So there's 4 big things to think about, right? The first thing is just the way the US is set up. If you think about land and the assets of, public or local government, there's typically 2 things. Either one, it's owned by the government or it's privatized. Right, you don't have kind of this in between where it's owned by the government, but then you have a private entity running it for the government, right? And the difference here, when we say privatized, essentially means you've sold the thing to like a third party and they actually own it, as opposed to the government still owning it and transferring ownership for another person to run, right? So in the US, primarily, you don't have kind of that setup where you can own and then, transfer. And then the second thing that we'll have is an inventory problem, right? In that in the US, given the federal structure of how the government works, and when you go to a lot of local government or in cities, things are fragmented. Piece of land, something is owned by the county, another piece is owned by, the school board, another piece is owned by, transport, so there's not a single clear part of who owns things, and it takes, it's not so easy to be able to quickly arrive at, a single ownership structure of those things. So that's kind of the second challenge that you have to deal with. And then the third thing here is like I mentioned earlier, is around this, the valuation, right? In that you would have to modify or update the law such that people are not valuing things at book value, right? You need to then be able to look at fair market value for those things. It's not just that. It's it's also then a very manual process. You got to have surveyors go out and measure all of these pieces of land, such that you can then say, okay, here's actually how much it's worth, So it's tedious, a manual process that makes it, kind of difficult to be able to do, right? And then there's political friction, let's be frank, right? Sometimes, politicians and folks want to be able to keep control, of the land, right? So you don't want to transfer that ownership and control of it to, a private entity. So you got to be able to overcome, some of that kind of political friction to get it set up. And the last piece here is also like, they're just lacking of a know-how or like an understanding of the concept. You need people who've actually implemented this before to be able to engage and actually get it set up, right? So those are some of the challenges of why this hasn't really taken off in the US as much, right? So we're not going to solve all of this here today, right? We are the data and AI event after all. So there's got to be an AI angle to this, right? So we think that there is a role that data and AI can play in terms of helping with some of these challenges, right? As part of the solution. And the first thing is where, AI can really help in really three areas. The first piece is addressing that fragmentation problem that we talked about earlier. The fact that this land is scattered and has, several ownership. So we're able to address that. And then the other thing is being able to help with those valuations. Remember I talked about earlier, it's a very manual process sometimes to go out and get, all of the valuations. And then the last piece is once you actually have the land or you put some entity or an asset on there, how do you maximize your return from it, right? And so AI can also help with some of those. So in this first piece around solving the inventory problem, there's a lot, and I'll show you guys an example here soon. There's a lot of tools that we can use today to be able to really bring a lot of the data into a single pane of glass, where it makes it easier to be able to look at and know, who has ownership of the land, right? As opposed to where it's kind of very fragmented right now. And then in terms of the valuation piece, we can again also automate some of that work in terms of pulling, maybe tax records and all whatnot. As opposed to having people go out and manually do things. We can leverage a lot of tech to kind of, help with that automation as well. And then the last piece here is, again, in terms of once you actually have the assets and they're running, how can you increase the returns that you're getting from those assets in terms of using them well, so things like digital twins, or being able to do things like predictive maintenance, right? In figuring out when things are going to fail before it actually fails. With a lot of that, you can actually increase the yields and what you're getting from the assets, and then reinvest that money, into financing for public sector things that you have, right? So those are just some very few examples for how you can begin to think, how to leverage AI into some of this. So let me give you an example where this is not exactly doing something that's for an urban word fund, but the thinking and the work that we did here is directly applicable, to some of the concepts and the things that I talked about earlier. If you were in your first keynote this morning, you would have heard a little bit about some of the work that was done in St. Louis, where they had a tornado and it came through. And, very quickly, I was involved in that project. Within a day or so, we're able to very quickly pull a lot of the data together. And then leveraging AI, we were able to do a few things. First of all, the problem, what were they trying to solve, right? One is they wanted to figure out what's the economic impact of the damage, of the tornado. That was the first thing. And then the second thing was, from a recovery standpoint, how could we really optimize, the recovery, right? So the people who needed help can kind of get that help, when they needed it. So on that first piece about the economic recovery, we were able to use satellite imagery, and then to be able to very quickly assess, the level of damage for buildings. And then the second thing that was needed once you knew the level of damage was to say, okay, what's the economic impact of this damage? Right, so and then we're able to pull in, tax, assessor, values to be able for all of those buildings. Then you could estimate, here's how much damage that has. If I try and map this back to some of the things that we're talking about, there's no reason why we shouldn't be able to use similar ideas in terms of satellite imagery and some of the open source data that we'll have to begin to quickly identify and get, the inventory of those assets that we talked about earlier. And then in the same light, in terms of being able to figure out, some of the valuation, instead of doing it manually, you can leverage technology to be able to help with some of this. I'm not saying that this is a, kind of silver bullet that solves everything, but but it certainly gets you started and makes it a lot easier to be able to, address some of the pain points that I pointed out earlier. If you were trying to implement this, right? And so ultimately the question here is what's stopping us from doing this, right? We've essentially, we have the assets, like what I talked about, right? The thing sitting below the iceberg. It's a proven model because we've seen it work in other places before. We have some of the technologies that can help us address some of the pain points that I mentioned earlier. Cities are struggling with all of these challenges that they need to solve. If you can unlock this value, you can then use that to be able to invest and kind of make, solve those problems, right? So that's really the question that we want to try and discuss. I should have mentioned this up front, that the way I want to run the session is I'll spend some time up front here, like I just did, to run through a few slides, and then we want to open it up for discussion, right? So there's a series of questions that will make it, so it's essentially a round table. I know we're not all sitting around the table, but the point is for us to share our own ideas, given what you've heard today, where are we and how can we, kind of use some of this thinking, to help where we are. So with that in mind, I'm going to go to the set of questions to just guide our discussion. So I'll just open it up here for discussions. The first question here will be, again, what do folks think of the concept? Is this something that resonates, for some of the, kind of public sector leaders that we have in the room? Is this something that you've tried? So just open to hearing thoughts about this as well. So
this is an interesting concept, and I appreciate how you articulated the how, because oftentimes we will speak about ideas esoterically rather than translating them to implementation. I guess what's on my mind, and I think I mentioned this earlier on today, is the missed opportunity to stop focusing exclusively on monetizing and optimizing physical assets, and to think about how you would apply this framework to digital assets. If you think about infrastructure, I think there's an example we were talking about in a sidebar conversation where cities who lay broadband can then monetize the opportunity for telecoms to attach to the cables to then create revenue opportunities for programming digital divide, broadband connectivity for low-income communities. I wonder how you think that this model could apply to cities who can create the unity of data and package it and really think about valuing data so that it becomes a monetizable asset, because that's the currency of the future. I think we look at the physical environment, but there's an entire digital layer that cities are not able to leverage. So I'd love your thoughts on that in general.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's a great point, right? I like how you framed it, because it's also an asset. So if I go back and look at that iceberg that we have, instead of just talking about land and vacant buildings, this becomes one more thing that you add to that, right? And I would imagine that, the framework in terms of identifying those assets, valuing it, setting up an independent entity and putting the governance around that to be able to manage it, and then having a very clear outcome, like, hey, look, we want to maximize value from this, that works for the community. I think that could also work, in this case. That's absolutely not something that I actually thought about, but I think it's a great idea, to be able to sit down and think about, how do you package all of that and put it together, right? So it becomes where you're not just thinking about physical assets, but then you can add digital assets to it as well, Yeah.
So I think where the tension or the friction might exist is the valuation step, because we do not have a standard mechanism to value data on the open market like we do for other assets. It creates an opportunity to create a benchmark, like you create data standards on other things. But I think the city or the group of cities that cracks the nut on how to value and create a standard valuation for public data can then be at the forefront of monetizing it.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. So it's a great point. So
from a local government standpoint, what came to mind for me was understanding, excuse me, the risk associated with it and how to quantify that risk. It appears as though it's about taking on debt, and that debt, and without getting into a whole lot of the structure, I don't know where that rests, if it's with that other organization, that other entity that's set up, but hearing a little bit more about the risk, because that's the exercise that we'd go through to understand what that exposure may be for the local government.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's a good point. So you don't do this in a vacuum, right? Like you absolutely need to think through the trade-offs that come with this. Like in that example that I was giving about Copenhagen, that's certainly one of the things that they had to think about, right? Like there is the downside that, you might end up in a situation where you don't necessarily generate the funds that you need to be able to pay off kind of the initial amount that they needed in order to like get everything set up, so the governance and everything that needs to be put in place to ensure that like this works in a way that actually benefits the community, I agree with you, it has to be front and center and needs to be one of the things that, you would need to like factor into it, so, but let me ask you something. Assuming you were able to manage the race and everything, is it something as a local government, an idea that you think you would entertain? What are your thoughts about that? Yeah.
Absolutely, because we all of the governments, local governments, and I'll speak for them, we certainly are feeling the pressures and the pinch of our revenue sources, traditional revenue sources, certainly disappearing, financial crunch. So we're going to be forced. The reality of it is we're all going to be forced to try to find new and creative ways to generate the revenues to provide the services. So the concept, but ultimately it is going to come down to being able to evaluate that risk, and will your citizenry or the public constituents see this as kind of leveraging debt, and again, which goes to at what risk are we willing to take?
The one place in the U.S. where something like this has come closest is in Atlanta, right? So one of the things that they've done in Atlanta is they basically took asset of a lot of the land that they had. I think it was something like 700 parcels of land, and they've essentially put that into a public benefit corporation, similar to like what I was talking about earlier. And I think in the process of building a lot of mixed-use development that they can then use and again get the returns from that and kind of invest it. So it's not fully implemented in the US like some of the other examples that we talked about, but there are places in here where they're starting to look at how you can kind of leverage some of this as well. So yeah. Yes, Mayor.
Just a couple of questions, and just for full transparency, I am a consultant with SAN, so couple of things that came up that didn't come up when we talked about this before is, how does this differ from land banks? A lot of cities already have land banks where they put all of their city-owned property into an entity that is adjacent to the city but still city-owned. And how do we account for redlining that often happens in urban areas where the city-owned property is severely undervalued? And how do we adjust or account for the effect of redlining that currently happens in urban cities?
Yeah, no, I think those are great points. So I guess on the land banks that you were talking about earlier, how are those being managed? Is that a private entity that has is it passed over to a private entity to own and manage, or how does that, can you say a bit more?
So the way that it runs in St. Louis is we have a nonprofit called the St. Louis Development Corporation, that the land bank or the land reutilization authority sits under that nonprofit. And their sole purpose is to hold city-owned property either for future development or for people who want to do one-off projects. And currently, I would just say this is just St. Louis, where say you wanted to buy a piece of property, then the alderperson for that ward where that property is has to approve it before you buy it. And then you also have to present a plan to redevelop said property. Oftentimes it's very subjective because sometimes you can't get in touch with the alderman to approve it.
Yeah.
Or that alderman doesn't like you and is not going to return your phone calls. It's a mess. So depending on the city, you have to standardize that process, make them objective as possible in order to be able to sell that land. But that land is often, or those buildings are sold at a deep discount, sometimes even $1.
Yeah.
So that's
absolutely. I think
how that works.
So I think in this case, right, it's similar, but it didn't go all the way, right? So if you think about what some of these other folks did, it wasn't necessarily about selling the land. It's like you put all of that land together, you get a private entity to be able to manage that land. And there's a clear objective, in terms of the governance that you put around it. Right. And that objective is around maximizing the value that comes from it. Now, the community and city leadership need to be clear in defining what that value is that they're trying to maximize. But it's not about just holding the land and then we kind of sell it. And I also think that this actually can be an opportunity to help with some of like the redlining that we talked about, because, rather than look at them as one-off things, you're essentially looking and saying, hey, look, for this block of area that was maybe redlined, how do I take this whole piece and develop it jointly such that, it kind of improves the value of all of the things that are in that neighborhood, right? So I think some of that, like approaching it that way, some of the things that I think these can actually help with, to be honest.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And I would say one caveat when you're if that is your case, depending on who's in the room, as the property values increase, you also want to develop policies that make sure that those who are currently there don't get priced out of those neighborhoods. So in St. Louis, we also developed a senior property tax, because they're mostly senior citizens. So we developed a senior property tax freeze that goes along with that. So our seniors, their property taxes don't go up when the land value of the neighborhood starts to improve.
Yeah, absolutely. We're about to end it here, but like one last comment. The criticism that you typically hear about urban world funds revolves around exactly the point that you're making, in that you end up pricing, right? Some of the incentives will come to a point where things are misaligned. And so if you're not careful, you can end up in a situation like what Mayor Jones is talking about. So unfortunately, we're at time. Thank you very much. Really love the engagement. Again, something to think about as you travel back to your various locations. So thanks a lot. So.